up for it.
When you hear I Want to Hold Your Hand, I said, wow.
It was great to see a group having success, and a great kind of role model.
I've never heard anything so cool.
The Beatles sort of liberated us.
They literally changed our lives.
Certainly, I Want to Hold Your Hand was the breakthrough record. America, therefore, has a magic place in kind of music history, mythology.
I Want to Hold Your Hand opened the door to everything that the Beatles would become.
I Want to Hold Your Hand was the song that really brought them. What the Beatles were doing was, to a large degree, bringing American music back to American shores.
Clearly, they changed music, they changed politics, they changed the sociology of British society, they changed everything.
They changed fashion, they changed hairstyles.
The Fab Four had their little suits and mop tops and stuff.
The 60s grew up with the Beatles.
Before the Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand, love songs were all, oh, my little girl, she's so cute and she's very pretty and I really love her. And then all of a sudden they come out with words and lyrics that were a little more sexy. They were more adult. They were more sophisticated.
It was the baby boomers coming of age all over the world, and they all spoke the same language, and the language was rock and roll.
I still can feel an enormous sense of joy when I listen to the songs.
It's the way in which, people grew all this hair and people began to use their clothes to send messages, the way in which people would receive music. None of that would have happened had it not been for the Beatles, and the story that begins with I Want to Hold Your Hand.
If there was ever a moment in history when events conspired to forever change the course of society, it came during those gray days of post-war Britain. The 50s had been a decade of austerity. Public morality was almost Victorian, and fashion, well, it was very much a reflection of those bleak times. And then came the 60s, and the emergence of four mop-top lads known as the Beatles. Their music, rooted in good old American rock and roll, was first heard in the clubs and church halls of their native Liverpool.
People would ask me, what's Liverpool really like? And I said, it's kind of horrible, it's like a port town, and the minute anyone makes any money, they tend to leave. But for them, Liverpool was like some magical nirvana.
As the Beatles arrived in America in early 1964, their uncomplicated songs of teen love immediately struck a chord with an American public longing for a return to innocence. It marked the beginning of a remarkable journey for the Fab Four, from the Beatlemania of their early career to the pervasive culture-altering presence of the group, collectively and individually through the 70s and beyond. It started with a song and a simple, virtuous wish.
I Want to Hold Your Hand was such a significant song, partly because of the timing, when it came in history, in January of '64, right after the assassination of President Kennedy. I can remember living in Boston and being, it was a sad time. It was winter, it was depressing, it was post-Christmas.
We were a lost country at the time. We were lost souls, and I think they came along at just a perfect time. The Beatles provided an antidote for what was going on in the U.S. at that time.
It was about the containment of communism internationally, and that implied, for people like J. Edgar Hoover, head of the FBI, the containment of these subversive energies at home, the energies of the civil rights movement, the energies of youth in many ways. And many people looking at the Beatles saw them as a representative of a dangerous rock and roll culture, a culture that was about race mixing, a culture that was about self-indulgence, a culture that was about a kind of threatening sexual freedom.
What happened was a juggernaut.
This is Britain's revenge for the Boston Tea Party.
When the Beatles arrived in the United States, rock and roll was coming out of a quiet period. The early generation of rock and rollers had been taken out of the scene, some of it fairly consciously. Little Richard had left rock and roll, Chuck Berry had been put in jail, Elvis had been drafted and put in the army. When he came out, he was a very different kind of figure than he had been previously, and those people had been replaced in the rock and roll landscape by teen idol figures, people like Fabian. And the Beatles brought the original energy of rock and roll back to the United States.
I'm a big Beatles fan and I love them.
Do you mind a lady talking?
In the mid-60s, Paul McCartney was dating British actress Jane Asher. It was in the basement of the Asher family home at 57 Wimpole Street in London that McCartney and John Lennon wrote a number of their early songs, including I Want to Hold Your Hand. Peter Asher is Jane's brother. and one half of the 60s British recording duo Peter and Gordon, who had one of their biggest hits with the Lennon-McCartney composition, World Without Love.
I recall one day in particular when John came over and he and Paul were down in the basement, and Paul called to me upstairs and asked me if I wanted to come down and hear a song that they had just finished. And so I came downstairs and they sat side by side on the piano bench and played I Want to Hold Your Hand. And I thought it was very good, to say the least.
Musically, it had an appeal that was broad. It was simple enough and catchy. It didn't stray far from the idea of wanting to hold your hand.
It definitely had a unique sound, but it wasn't totally from another planet, you know. Even at the time, people were making references to Buddy Holly and, you know, that's Little Richard, you know, obviously.
I Want to Hold Your Hand is a painfully simple song to me. What comes across in retrospect now, having not liked it as a little kid, what comes across now when I listen to it is the exuberance in it, is the sheer ecstasy of it, the joy and the innocence of it. And that I don't think I heard at the time. Now when I listen to it, I hear something very fun and bouncy and fresh and fizzy.
It was just a smash killer single, and had a great sound, great beat. They had the cleverness of Paul McCartney. Nobody's more prolific and nobody's more brilliant in the business. Then you had the rawness of John Lennon, too. You had George in there plucking away on the guitar, and it was a fantastic chemistry, obviously.
We had never heard that much electric guitar and that loud and powerful, but with the nice contrast.
Not only the song, but it was the groove also. You know, we'd just come out of the Elvis Presley days, and certainly we were looking for new icons.
By the time the Beatles arrived in America for their first tour, which included 2 appearances on The Ed Sullivan Show, I Want to Hold Your Hand had already hit the top of the charts. By March of 1964, as the group worked on their first feature-length movie, Hard Day's Night, Beatlemania was in full nova in America.
The Beatles and the British invasion as a whole happened not because there was something in the air culturally, but that after many, many years of imitating American music and trying to... Rock and roll is an American invention. And if you listen to British acts of the 50s who are trying to do that, they're really, really lame. They're really bad.
All the British stars who'd been to America were American imposters. Do you know what I mean? Like Cliff Richards, he was a wonderful, wonderful entertainer. But until he came out in like the 60s, because of the Beatles, he was really just a copycat of Elvis. And before the Beatles, we didn't really have anything that kind of our own. So when the Beatles, you know, our band, who we all loved and admired so much, actually visibly conquered America, both in terms of the news reports and the fact being #1 meant a lot to us. That was impressive.
The Beatles got the news that I Want to Hold Your Hand had hit the top of the charts while staying at the Georges V Hotel in Paris. They also received their itinerary for their first U.S. tour, which would include a show at the Hollywood Bowl in Los Angeles and a historic concert at the cavernous Shea Stadium in New York.
It was pandemonium.
It was just this atmosphere of being sort of on a runway with a jet plane taking off, the sound of it.
It's hot. A lot of people just passed out.
I said to myself, oh, I'm definitely not going to faint because I don't want to lose 1 minute of this.
The screaming was so loud that you couldn't hear the music.
Higher pitch, but never
Screamed
subsided.
for the whole 30 minutes.
But we knew that they could hear our screams and that we were there and we were for them. We're Beatle fans.
It was unbelievable. The 55,000 seats had been sold out. There were easily over 1,000 press people, and still hundreds of press people from around the world were calling me for tickets. It's just amazing. And I knew that it was going to be a very, very special day. If I wasn't sure before, I certainly was with the reaction to the announcement that the Beatles are coming to Shea Stadium.
The reaction on the West Coast was no less frenzied, as Bob Eubanks, promoter of the Hollywood Bowl concert, recalls.
The town was on fire, and we sold them out in theaters.
Another sign of Beatlemania in America was the group's total domination of the pop charts, at one point holding down the top 5 positions on the Billboard Hot 100 chart with singles that included I Want to Hold Your Hand. They also had 7 other singles on the same chart.
When they had 5 songs at all in the top 10 of the Billboard charts. It was, I can remember that. It was just like unheard of. Nothing like that had ever occurred before. Way bigger than Elvis. I mean, just huge.
The Beatles revolutionized the world of fashion as their collarless Nehru jackets, tailored suits with flared pants, and high-heeled Beatle boots soon became all the rage. The Beatles' shaggy hairdos, which started a trend to longer hairstyles for men, never failed to court controversy and the odd snide comment.
When the quartet with hair like unmade beds arrive in the Netherlands, it's the same story as in Britain and the U.S. People who value their sanity head for color and let the teenagers take over.
When it hit, I mean, it hits in such a big way that you couldn't help but notice. I mean, it became a huge fashion statement.
Once you saw them, you had the image of these guys who, wow, what a different look. The looks of the instruments they played. There were all kinds of things.
I remember the first night I saw the Beatles on the Ed Sullivan Show. I went to school the next day with my hair. I always had like really long bangs and long hair. I tied my hair back so I would only have these long bangs, you know, and I thought, I felt like a Beatle.
The parents were up in arms about the, you know, because they were overtly sexy and talked, you know, and chatting up birds and all that stuff. And long hair, you know, became synonymous with, you know, crimes against nature.
If you were a long-haired guy, forget it. The girls loved you.
The first time I brought a boy home that had, you know, a Beatle cut, and we're talking here, and my father embarrassed me so much because he was sitting with his back to the door, and my father walked into the room and said, "Hello, young lady." You know, it was like, oh my gosh.
The Beatles just always grew and grew. When you look at them through these different stages, you know, through their different albums, and when you think of them, you know, in those early days with the Mersey beat, Brian Epstein did their little, you know, the Nehru suit.
The return to tailored suits for men with snug-fitting slacks was one of the Beatles' early influences on a British fashion industry going through boom times in the 60s, centered in places like Kings Road, Chelsea, and Carnaby Street in London.
Prior to the Beatles, the suit was more or less something worn by crooners. It was this kind of totem of respectability in the establishment. And in putting the Beatles in a suit, not only did Brian Epstein create a group look, he kind of introduced a completely different style to pop culture in a sense, especially given that the suits themselves were distinctive compared with your average grey two-piece.
The impact of the Beatles' hair, looks, style, attitude, everything about the Beatles we all imitated.
All of a sudden they morphed into the guys from Sgt. Pepper's, you know, and they all of a sudden adopted this whole other persona, or the guys from Magical Mystery Tour, and they were just a bunch of hippie freaks, and they kept taking us through these different, really, looks and images and fashion concepts.
They influenced popular culture by first defining a great cultural alternative to more boring, safe music. The subject matter got very interesting. The looks of the Beatles, the idea that drugs, people didn't know what drugs were, things like marijuana and LSD, and that definitely played a part. And also spiritual growth and looking at religions outside of the more normal religions in England and the United States and Canada. They started looking at things from India and those influences and those ways of looking at things.
People say, oh, this is the generation gap taking over. This just possibly can't be a generation gap. It's just a very, very simple question of people not listening to each other. That's all it is.
A group like the Beatles and a song like I Want to Hold Your Hand gave us a sense that we could express ourselves in ways that we were not able to express ourselves before. You could explore other aspects of American culture and actually have a say in politics.
It was really a sign of a generation coming into its own as a big, powerful demographic. Kids rule. This was a time when you trusted no one over 30. Everyone was a flower child. Everyone was into the new music, into sort of living this rock life.
The 60s grew up with the Beatles. It starts as this almost innocent, I just want to hold your hand. I want to hold your hand opened the door to everything that the Beatles would become.
They definitely were the first step, I think, in a serious revision of the British class system, and suddenly it became cool to be working class.
The Beatles, fresh from an audience with the Queen, they hold medals, indicating they have been made members of the most excellent order of the British Empire.
The Beatles helped to create a whole kind of cultural identity that was different from much of what came before, whether it had to do with protests, experimenting with drugs, the way in which people dressed themselves, the way in which they did their hair. The Beatles helped kick off a whole series of phenomena that did make that possible.
After the Beatles, rock and roll was not just about the little 45. It was about the album. It was about buying a body of work. Rock and roll becomes an art form.
The Beatles came in and said, hey, we write our own stuff, we choose our producer, we get our record label, we do what we want to do.
The Beatles' influence also extended to a number of the rock and roll legends that they had idolized themselves while growing up, even though initially some of these rock icons were somewhat skeptical.
I called my wife and told her, I said, you know them four little boys sing that, yeah, my kids go around the house, I want to hold your hand, yeah. I said, yo, you like them little boys look like girls, man. But them little girls turned my life around.
Perkins toured with the Fab Four in the mid-60s, and then the up-and-comers who would record 3 of Perkins' songs had the chance to compare notes with the legend.
I'm sitting in the floor with a rhythm guitar, John, Paul, George, and Ringo sitting on the couch asking me how I kicked off certain old Sun songs, and George would say, see, I told you guys, we've been doing it in G. I told you it was E. Songs like Honey Don't.
I looked around one day and in the chart there was a Bobby B and a Bobby Denton, and a Bobby here and a Bobby there, and everybody on the top 5. So I called up my boys, the Beatles. And they took care of them.
It took the British invasion to get us interested in our own music. The British bands, the Beatles, they recognized Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison and all these guys, and made it accessible to teenagers because we all wanted to be cool here. So it's like country music in a lot of ways was sort of like, nah, I can't listen to country music because then I'll be considered some old like redneck guy or whatever. It took the guys in England in these bands to let us know that our own stuff was cool and not to be ashamed of it.
They came over and just took this country and the world by storm. It changed the complexion of the technology in terms of what was used, guitars. The whole style of music changed.
I Want to Hold Your Hand brought that beat back, and that's what rock and roll had been about.
The saying goes that if you remember the 60s, you weren't there. One of the few exceptions to that adage is most certainly the recollection of where you were on the night of February 9th, 1964, when the Beatles made that historic appearance on the Ed Sullivan Show.
Well, the Ed Sullivan Show were the days when people had one television set, the whole family gathered around, and you'd go from the Beatles to Maria Callas to Topo Gigio, so there was always something for somebody.
I can remember the next day, actually February 10th, 1964, I bothered my father and mother till I said, please, I have to have a guitar. So it turned a lot of people into musicians. I know that for a fact.
Like most musicians from that era that I know of, you always fantasize about being, seeing what the Beatles did, and going through all that.
The Beatles was probably the big influence. Whoever was playing rhythmically. I loved all that.
Groups like the Mamas and the Papas, who were topping the charts with pop classics like California Dreamin' and Monday Monday, were the great American hope against the British invasion. But patriotism aside, they also found themselves under the spell of the fresh new sound of the Beatles.
Jimmy said, put these earphones on, okay? And he played me like the first 2 Beatle albums.
And he started listening to this music. And then he would start playing it himself, listening to it himself. And Cass came over and she loved the Beatles. They're English. So she started ramming John with the Beatles, the sounds, these harmonies, these counterpoint and all this stuff.
There was a definite feeling of competition between the Beach Boys and the Beatles, but it was more like an inspired tennis match. You hit one and the person returns it, and if it's a good volley, there was a good volley going on there for a few years in the 60s. Rubber Soul got Brian thinking about Pet Sounds, got the Beatles, Paul McCartney and John Lennon thinking about Sgt. Pepper's. So there was definitely a really nice interplay between the groups.
The Beatles were a great influence on us, and not only were they a great group, they were singing their own songs. They were writing, they were being innovative, they were bringing out single after single. I Want to Hold Your Hand. Let's do one like I Want to Hold Your Hand. They didn't do that. They kept everything different.
I can remember hearing I Want to Hold Your Hand being played on the radio for the first time that I heard it. And I remember driving down Ventura Boulevard thinking, boy, I'd love to be one of the Beatles.
Who is Frank Sinatra? Well, let me tell you who Frank Sinatra is. I hope the Beatles in 20 years are as famous as Frank Sinatra.
That was 1964. 4 decades later, a study indicates that 95% of Americans can identify at least one of the Beatles, who were recently ranked as the 3rd largest grossing artist in show business, second only to director Steven Spielberg and TV host Oprah Winfrey.
The Beatles, their music grows in stature with every passing year, whereas the other ones who keep coming back and, should we dare we say, stain the image? Because you can never be as good as you were unless you add things.
The test of time has proven that, you know, it's just unbelievable, the wealth of material and the quality of that songwriting.
The resurgence of Beatlemania among a new audience this time is actually a really interesting phenomenon.
So I've been doing the tours now for about 12 years, and at that time I've taken around 100,000 people, 8,000 people a year, so it's still alive and well, Beatlemania.
I have a lot of kids coming in, mainly teenagers, and the older boomers, the established boomers that have a lot of discretionary income that they can, you know, buy the fancy autographs and stuff like that. So it's a wide demographic from the young to the old. It's nice to see that, to kind of keep, you know, this thing alive from, you know, generation to generation.
Well, I'm most attached to the things I had when I was, the original dolls I had when I was a kid. I think those are the things that hold the most sentimental value for me anyways, and I would never part with those things in a million years.
There's a manner in which every boomer is part Beatle.
We've gone through the 80s, we've gone through the new generation, gone through the search for the BMWs and all that, and that's not what it's about. You know? It's about that essence that came through in that music.
It's a connection for people of my generation. I was really aware of how important all of that was, that we were fortunate to be alive at a moment when something was happening to so many young women at the same time.
It was an amazing time, it really was.
My name is Paul, this is Ringo, John, George, good night.
SRO Entertainment presents on DVD the exciting new series, Impact, Songs That Changed the World. Each program puts the spotlight on a song that made an impact on society and transformed the cultural and political landscape. The programs feature the song's creators and explore how each song changed society. Guests include recording artists, music industry executives, cultural and political pundits, and the music fans themselves, for whom these songs became the soundtrack of their generation. Programs in this series include Nirvana, Smells Like Teen Spirit.
Of course, no record label prospers without the right artist. It was Sub Pop which first recorded Nirvana, whose success inspired a boom in do-it-yourself recording, as the music, once classified as alternative, went mainstream. So-called grunge fashion, with its ripped jeans, faded flannel shirts, and worn-out Converse sneakers, was soon in vogue around the world. Bands like Screaming Trees, also from Seattle, were quick to discover how fast and how far afield the style had spread as they toured the country.
They were in New York, and all of a sudden they realized that what they were wearing, that they'd been made fun of for their entire career, was now being sold as high fashion.
He writes these incredibly dark and depressing songs, and yet he's married and he just brought a child into the world. And I asked him why he did that. And he answered that
I really was a lot more negative and angry and everything else a few years ago, but that had a lot to do with not having a mate, you know, not having a steady girlfriend and stuff like that. So you know, that was one of the main things that was bothering me, that I wouldn't admit at the time, you know. So now that I've found that, the world seems a lot better for some reason. You know, it's just
The Ramones,
I Want to Be Sedated.
Sounds like a bubblegum song.
Yeah.
Bam, 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 bam. It's almost like a 1910 Fruit Gum Company song, you know?
Who were a big influence on the Ramones. So were Herman's. Second verse, same as the first, Joey.
These guys grew up on pop music.
Yeah.
The Ramones were basically a oldies influenced band turned up loud for the 70s, 80s, and 90s. It was enough already, you know. There was all this fusion of rock, jazz rock, blues rock. So Ramones wanted to bring back the simplicity of rock music when it came out.
Punk music and the birth of the Ramones was really the recreation of rock and roll, and it brought it right back down to its basic three primary colors. And that was the beauty of the whole thing, was that you didn't have to be a Juilliard graduate.
We grew out of the whole punk ideal, which was anyone can be in a band, anyone can get together and can write some songs and go out there and do it. And we did, that's really the story of U2. We just decided that this is what we wanted to do, and we went after it.
And with this new simplified music came a rebellious and energetic form of self-expression.
I agree with the assessment of punk rock as a lot of, like 1,000 no's that equaled one giant yes. I think it was an empowering thing to a lot of people and really life affirming.
Run DMC and Aerosmith, Walk This Way.
Disco was the big thing, and we had to find records to rap over, and we couldn't rap over disco. So it was the DJ's job to go out and find records with hard beats, and we would wind up finding records like Aerosmith, the beat that they have at the beginning of the record, and Billy Squier, and it started off as just us using their beats. But sometimes we let a little guitar play.
We had already been hearing Walk This Way at parties for a long time, but everybody was like, wow. When it's all said and done, what most people don't realize is that it's all music. Good music is good music. And what Jay was doing, Jam Master Jay was doing, and what Joe Perry and Steve Tyler were doing, were taking the best bits of what they knew and making something of it. There were certain records that at that time, just like there was Walk This Way, there was another one, Bites the Dust, that was another theme song like that. There was Rapture by Blondie, that was another big song. There were these underground hits that were like, that the community was digging. And Wagner Live in Color would not have been possible without Walk This Way and without what Run DMC did and what Prince did.
It wasn't long before hip-hop style and fashion from the street had started to be seen in the stores of suburban shopping malls. Run DMC had a very recognizable look, and it started catching on.
They had their own style. It was a lot different from kind of the other rappers at the time. The way they wore leather suits, the fact that they wore fedoras, the Adidas. It was their own signature that they kind of put on the music.
Madonna, Like a Virgin.
Like a Virgin hit the top of the charts in America during Christmas of 1984, where it remained for 6 weeks. Over the next few months, she would appear on the cover of Time magazine, play the title role in the film Desperately Seeking Susan, and inspire Madonna Land, a clothing concession in Macy's department stores. Her Virgin tour was the hot concert ticket during the first half of 1985.
Everybody could achieve the Madonna look. Everybody could do her formula. And it was a very girly, fun formula of makeup and sexiness and self-expression.
That inner wear is outer wear.
She did open a lot of doors, and she was actually blamed for it by the feminists in America. Like, you retrograde everything, you bring everything. No, I don't think so. I think she stepped ahead and had the courage to do it.
The Beatles, I Want to Hold Your Hand.
The Beatles came in and said, hey, we write our own stuff, we choose our producer, we get our record label, we do what we want to do.
The Beatles' influence also extended to a number of the rock and roll legends that they had idolized themselves while growing up. Perkins toured with the Fab Four in the mid-60s, and then the up-and-comers who would record 3 of Perkins' songs had the chance to compare notes with the legend.
I'm sitting in the floor with a rhythm guitar, John, Paul, George, and Ringo sitting on the couch asking me how I kicked off certain old Sun songs, and George would say, see, I told you guys, we've been doing it in G. I told you it was E. Sounds like Honey Don't.
I looked around one day and in the chart there was a Bobby V and a Bobby Denton, and a Bobby here and a Bobby there, and there was Bobby on the top 5. So I called up my boys, the Beatles. And they took care of them.
It took the British invasion to get us interested in our own music. The British bands, the Beatles, they recognized Carl Perkins and Johnny Cash and Roy Orbison and all these guys, and made it accessible to teenagers because we all wanted to be cool here. So it's like country music in a lot of ways was sort of like, nah, I can't listen to country music because then I'll be considered some old like redneck guy or whatever. It took the guys in England in these bands to let us know that our own stuff was cool and not to be ashamed of it.
Elvis Presley, Heartbreak Hotel.
Elvis Presley came along and just, of course, turned the world upside down. And he was a guy that made it possible for us hillbillies to play rock music because it was before then it was always keyboard and saxophone and that sort of thing. And of course, Scotty Moore brought the guitar right into the forefront.
With the three of us, I tried to play some kind of rhythm and more or less just steps and notes here and there.
That was when I first heard it. Elvis was the biggest influence on my guitar playing.
Bob Marley, I Shot the Sheriff.
The song was of equal importance to both Bob and Clapton because for Clapton it reignited a dormant career and put him back on the charts, higher than he'd ever been. And for Bob, it was the final piece in the puzzle of international recognition.
I Shot the Sheriff was crucial in defining Bob's role as a political revolutionary or musical revolutionary. It did kind of endear him to an audience, an international audience that was looking for a rebel. I was looking for someone who could carry the flame of rebellion in a time in which the 60s were waning, in times that revolutionary fervor that drove a lot of the counterculture movement of the 60s was also kind of dissipating. And here was someone who emerged with this kind of revolutionary vision, and it was really crystallized in a song like I Shot the Sheriff.
The Bee Gees, Staying Alive.
Though the Bee Gees were no strangers to the top of the pop charts around the world, during the disco era of the late 70s, the group went to #1 with 6 consecutive singles, including Staying Alive, a song that transcended the dance floor and came to define a time, a place, and a culture in transition.
Staying Alive is not about dancing. Staying Alive is not about nightclubs. Staying Alive is about surviving in the city, in present day, at that time, New York City. Quite recently, September the 11th. Because it has in the lyrics, it's whether you're a brother or whether you're staying alive, staying alive.
Case where there have been disco records being made, and it was basically dance music that was at clubs like Studio 54 or whatever, and then suddenly you have the Bee Gees, who had been this pop group, sort of almost a British invasion type group back in the 60s doing these pop songs. Suddenly they come out and do a song that's heavily disco driven, and bang, the door opens and there's disco music all over.
With the Bee Gees coming into disco music, I think that disco music definitely became a music that transcended race, creed, color, age group, everything. And that was one of the things that I really liked about it. And I have to say that Staying Alive was one of the songs that started that trend.
Chuck Berry, Maybelline.
I used to have an old dance set, 45 and long player, record player in my bedroom, and I used to get import records from America on the old Chess and R&B label, Chuck Berry singles, Blue Feeling by Chuck. I really like that. That was my first introduction to that kind of chord shape.
Aspiring musicians who saw Chuck Berry in those early days came away from his show with admiration for his showmanship and the aesthetics of the instruments he played.
I always loved the shape and the look of this guitar. Chuck Berry, of course, he was using one, I think it was a 355 or 345, but it was the same style of guitar, and it just looked great, and I loved the sound. I saw him play in Swindon, in my hometown, and the sound he got from it was great, real clanky kind of dirty old sound. And then, of course, a lot of the Beatles, the Liverpool and Manchester groups started using them as well.
I was lucky enough to get what I call the Chuck Berry model. When that guitar came in, I mean, guys lined up to see this. For the first Gibson that came into Winnipeg that had the coolness about it because it looked like a Scotty Moore guitar or a Chuck Berry guitar. We can only see those guys on American Bandstand, you know, when Chuck Berry would be on American Bandstand, or when Elvis was on Ed Sullivan.
Aretha Franklin, Respect.
Have a woman come along and say, give me some respect and here's why I deserve it, was, you know, one of those things that caused women to just kind of get up on their chairs and yes, and start swinging banners and all of that.
When she recorded Respect, Aretha was still processing her hair. It was straightened hair. She was still wearing generally very fashionable gowns. She always loved high fashion. Within a year or two, Aretha had changed. She had adopted African robes, African headdresses. She was wearing her hair in a natural style. And that signaled a change in Black America, that people embraced their own black selves.
Shania Twain, Any Man of Mine.
Shania Twain's sense of style also had huge impact on country. In fact, when her record sales started to explode, some naysayers focused on sex appeal as the reason for her popularity. Shania was obviously more than just a pretty face, and this flew in the face of some pretty entrenched preconceptions.
Before, usually country singers looked different. They stood out. They had on Western outfits, cowboy hats, those kinds of things. I prepared a lecture for my students on how everything has changed since Shania Twain, and we kind of did, you know, BT and AT, before Twain and after Twain, and we looked at photographs of artists like Trisha Yearwood, Reba McEntire, Martina McBride, Faith Hill, and we also looked at their videos, and it was so obvious.
Band-Aid, Do They Know It's Christmas?
On the night of October 23, 1984, viewers of the BBC 6 o'clock news watched and listened as reporter Michael Burke revealed the staggering toll that a lengthy drought and famine had taken on the people of Ethiopia. For Bob Geldof, a rock singer and songwriter who had also been a lifelong social activist, Michael Burke's poignant commentary was a call to action.
It was intellectually an absurdity that people should die of want in a world of surplus. This seemed to be so fundamental a crime, and I viewed it as a crime, I felt it as a crime, that not to do something else, you would be complicit in the mass murder of what the journalist told me was the potential death of 30 million people.
As a reporter, he was definitely saying the world has to do something. It was as if he was begging somebody to come forward and somehow solve this extraordinarily difficult humanitarian situation.
I'll never forget the way that Phil Collins went from Live Aid in Wembley to Philadelphia, and the fact he could do that during one performance and then perform in both Wembley and Philadelphia showed that the world was becoming much smaller.
Phil played very early on at our show, shot off to helicopter, picked him up, took him to the airport, got on the Concorde with the whole film crew and all sorts of people, and it all worked brilliantly. And there, lo and behold, the next thing you saw him was on the screen. Phil Collins is playing in Philadelphia.
That day, full of symbolism of the Concorde flying low, dipping its wings and going, these great technology, every satellite possible linked together for the first time ever, talking to everyone, as many people as humanly possible, could focus on a point of view and an argument and an objective, if that objective was posited. And if you agreed, we could move together to deal with this issue, and we did.
For more information about this important new DVD series, Impact, Songs That Changed the World, Visit us on the web at www.culture.com.